The morning sun had barely pierced the horizon's veil when Elias Thorne heard a sound that would ripple through his life like a stone cast into still water. It was a frantic, piercing cry, trembling across the boundless expanse of the Wildhaven wilderness. A sound unlike any he'd encountered in his 15 years as a forest warden. This wasn't the familiar howl of a wolf or the rustle of deer through underbrush. It was something raw, desperate, and wholly out of place. It was a call that would soon force him into the boldest, or perhaps the most reckless, decision of his career. A choice that would peel back the layers of nature's mystery to reveal its capacity for the extraordinary. Elias lived alone in his weathered cabin, perched on the edge of the sprawling Emberwood forest, a place where the wild whispered its secrets to those who listened. Over the years, he'd grown intimate with its rhythms. The creak of ancient pines, the gurgle of crystal streams, the distant calls of nocturnal hunters. His daily patrols wove through towering evergreens and along shimmering waterways, each step reinforcing one unshakable truth. Mother bears reigned as the most perilous souls in these woods. They were guardians forged by instinct, willing to tear through flesh and bone to shield their cubs. Every warden knew this by heart. Every survival manual etched it in bold. Stay clear of bear cubs. No exceptions, no compromise. Elias's cabin was a gallery of the forest's life, its walls adorned with photographs he'd painstakingly captured. Elk bathed in the soft glow of dawn's mist, wolves gliding like shadows through fresh snow, eagles carving arcs across the jagged peaks that loomed above. But bears? Those he framed from the sanctuary of his truck or a lofty observation post, their images frozen in moments of quiet power, especially in spring, when mothers roused from hibernation, gaunt and fierce, their cubs trailing behind like fragile shadows. That spring morning dawned as countless others had. Elias tugged on his time-worn warden jacket, its fabric frayed at the cuffs from years of service, and checked his gear with the practiced ease of routine. Stepping into the crisp mountain air, he inhaled deeply, the sharp tang of pine needles flooding his senses as he embarked on his familiar patrol. The forest was a living tapestry, woven with beauty and danger, and experience had honed his vigilance. These woods brimmed with hidden threats, rockslides, sudden storms, the fleeting glimpse of a predator's eyes in the dusk, but none rivaled the unpredictability of a mother bear defending her young. In all his years, Elias had never dared to cross that line. He tracked their movements with a meticulous eye, warned campers of the risks with stern clarity, and kept a reverent distance, letting the wild unfold as it would. His fellow wardens often gathered over flickering campfires, trading tales of near misses with mother bears, each story a testament to their ferocity, a reminder of their dominion. A mother bear's wrath was a storm unleashed, her strength and devotion the forest's truest sovereigns. Golden sunlight slanted through the canopy as Elias traced the weathered markers along his trail, their wooden edges softened by seasons of rain and frost. His radio hummed intermittently, crackling with the casual chatter of other wardens. Reports of a downed tree here, a lost hiker there. The forest was stirring from its long winter slumber, shaking off the snow's embrace, and with that awakening came the resurgence of bear activity. Just the previous day, he'd knelt by the stream's edge, studying fresh tracks pressed into the damp earth. Large, deliberate prints shadowed by smaller ones, a mother and cub traversing their domain. The wilderness demanded respect, a quiet pact Elias had honored to survive. Its rules were carved into his bones. Never wedge yourself between a mother bear and her cub. Never trespass near their feeding grounds. Never mistake their might for anything tame or foreseeable. These weren't mere guidelines. They were the forest's commandments, laws of life and death that every warden carried like a second skin. He paused at his cherished lookout, a rocky perch overlooking the valley's sweep. Raising his binoculars, he scanned the expanse below, where the spring thaw had painted the forest floor with patches of dark, glistening mud. These slicks drew animals like moths to flame, elk pawing for tender shoots, deer nosing through the mire, but they were also traps, silent and unforgiving. He'd already hauled 2 deer from their depths that season, their panicked bleats echoing in his ears as he'd wrestled them free. Deer were one thing, manageable, predictable, but bears? They were a different beast entirely. their weight and will a force no rope or resolve could easily bend. His supervisor's voice lingered in his mind, a recent warning about heightened bear sightings near the eastern crest. 3 mother bears had been spotted there with their cubs. More than the usual dance of spring, a convergence that had prompted the closure of several trails. Nature was a wild symphony, ever shifting, but mother bears stood as its steady, perilous refrain. As Elias pressed deeper into his route, the weight of his rescue gear pressed against his shoulders. A standard burden for a warden, though he'd never imagined using it for a bear. The very notion of closing that distance, of stepping into their orbit, churned his gut with unease. Yet sometimes the wild doesn't ask. It demands, thrusting us against our deepest fears and most rigid beliefs. That morning, as the sun climbed higher, bathing the forest in a tender glow, Elias met such a demand. A faint whimper floated on the breeze, halting him mid-stride. He cocked his head, seasoned ears straining to trace its origin. The sound sharpened, a haunting blend of a cry and a mournful plea, drifting from the eastern marsh, where spring rains had sculpted a labyrinth of muddy pools, each a glistening snare. His pulse quickened as recognition dawned, the unmistakable pitch of a bear cub in peril, a sound that pierced the morning's calm like a blade. Against every shred of better judgment, Elias crept toward it, boots sinking slightly into the softening earth. The marsh unfurled before him, a patchwork of treacherous sinks and fledgling green, the air thick with the scent of wet soil. The cries grew sharper, more desperate, guiding his steps. He dropped low behind a fallen log, its bark rough against his palms, and peered out. His breath snagged in his throat. 50 feet ahead, a small black bear cub flailed in a deep mud pool. The more it struggled, the deeper it sank, its dark fur caked with thick, gray sludge, its frail body trembling. Elias's trained eye assessed the scene. Hours of entrapment had dulled its glossy coat to a matted shroud, its eyes glazed with exhaustion. Each thrash only tightened the mud's grip, its front paws clawing at a surface that offered no hold. His stomach twisted into a knot. Fresh bear tracks encircled the pool, large, deliberate imprints that could only belong to the mother. She tried to reach her cub, her efforts etched in the churned earth, but the unstable ground had repelled her. The tracks told a story of anguish, a mother's futile scramble to reclaim her young. Time was a thief. The cub's movements slowed, its cries softened to ragged gasps. The sun's warmth crept upward, promising dehydration's cruel bite. Elias reckoned it had been stuck since first light, perhaps through the night, its survival fraying with each breath. More ominous were the signs of the mother's nearness. Snapped twigs, trampled ferns, a restless orbit around the trap. She'd likely left to hunt, but her return loomed like a storm cloud, prickling the hairs on Elias's neck. A mother bear, cornered by desperation, was the forest's deadliest tempest. The cub strained once more, its efforts feeble, almost ghostly. Mud lapped at its chest, the suction a relentless jailer. Its small head slumped, eyes half-lidded in surrender, exhaustion carving shadows into its tiny frame. The sight clawed at Elias's heart. Without aid, it was doomed. Steam coiled from the warming mud, shrouding the cub in a spectral mist, a tableau that mocked his training. Wardens were taught to stand aside, to let nature's will turn unhindered. But this trap, worsened by human scars on the land, old trails, forgotten clearings, felt like a violation of that order. The cub's cries dwindled to whispers, its body quaking with each labored breath, the wilderness's cruel hand poised to claim it. Time slipped like sand through his fingers, the cub's hope bleeding away. Elias knew the mother could burst from the trees at any moment. The mud was a lethal quagmire, and every lesson from his 15 years roared at him to retreat. Yet, as he watched the cub's fading fight, a quiet certainty took root. Some moments demand we defy fear, shatter the rules, and stake everything on what feels just. He drew a steadying breath, resolve hardening, and made his choice. The cub's plight eclipsed every protocol etched into his mind. Moving with measured care, he shed his heavy jacket and gear belt, the fabric pooling at his feet. Less weight meant a slimmer chance of joining the cub in the mire. He plucked a sturdy branch from the ground, testing the mud's deceitful surface, plotting a path forward. The marsh's face was a liar. Patches that gleamed solid crumbled into hidden depths. He knotted a rope from his kit to a gnarled tree, its bark biting into the cord, a lifeline if the worst came. Mud sucked at his boots with each cautious step, sweat beading on his brow despite the morning's chill. The cub watched, too drained for fear, its chest heaving in shallow bursts. The mud had crept to its shoulders. Delay was death. 20 feet out, Elias's right leg plunged deep, cold sludge surging past his knee, then thigh, a clammy hand grasping at him. He leaned into the branch, spreading his weight, halting the descent. His heart thundered, a wrong move spelling ruin for them both. The mud waged war on his every motion, 15 feet still yawning between him and the cub. The young bear's eyes flared as Elias drew near, sparking a weak thrash that sent perilous waves through the muck, rocking his fragile perch. He murmured low, soothing tones to ease the cub and his own racing pulse. Each step was a grueling ballet, probing, shifting, the branch his sole anchor. 10 feet out, the mud deepened, fluid and fatal, a hungry abyss beneath. One misstep here could end him. The cub's fear surged, its faint growls a reminder of its wild blood. Small claws, yes, but sharp enough to rend. 5 feet away, Elias's legs quivered, the mud's pull a constant foe. The rope at his waist was a frail comfort. A fall could still trap him beyond reach. The cub bucked as he closed the gap, terror lending it fleeting strength, splattering muck in wild arcs. Elias paused, letting it tire, rushing in mid-panic courted disaster. Those tense minutes stretched into eternity as the cub's reserves bled out. At 5 feet, he began the rescue's heart, securing a rope around the cub without sinking himself. The mud here was a soupy grave, his boots finding no purchase, each shift a gamble. The cub's eyes locked with his, a storm of dread and fatigue swirling within. Elias readied the loop, arms trembling from clutching the branch, his lifeline in the mire. 3 feet now, its matted fur and flattened ears stark against the rippling mud, a fragile waltz on the edge of oblivion. The sun bore down, sweat stinging his eyes, the air thickening with strain. As Elias poised for his final reach, a sound stopped him cold, a deep, marrow-shaking growl rolling from the forest behind. His hands faltered on the branch, breath icing in his chest. The mother had returned, her growl swelling, a primal wave trembling through the stillness. Elias's position was a nightmare, waist-deep, defenseless, his gear abandoned far beyond reach. The branch felt like straw against her approach. Her heavy tread snapped twigs, a herald of doom. Turning with agonizing slowness, he glimpsed her, towering nearly 7 feet on hind legs, fur bristling like a storm cloud, muscles rippling as she dropped to all fours, eyes pinning him with lethal intent. Sunlight crowned her scarred face, a map of old battles etched into her flesh, her form a monument to raw power. 30 feet away, her nostrils flared, sifting the air, parsing the scene, her cub, the mud, the intruder. The cub whimpered at her silhouette, a frail thread in the quiet. Elias stood statue still, heart a war drum he feared she could hear. Her first steps were deliberate, wary, her gaze a blade that never wavered, dissecting him with a mind sharper than most credited. Each paw sank deep, her head swaying, a prelude every warden knew led to life or death. 20 feet now, her jaws parted, teeth glinting, claws raking the earth, her scent a wild gust on the breeze. Trapped, Elias faced a predator he couldn't outrun or outfight. Her growl deepened, a thunderclap across the clearing, her eyes dark pools of ancient fury. She saw only a threat, his purpose lost to her primal tide. 15 feet. Mist swirled as she lowered her head, the charge's harbinger. The mud clung tighter, an accomplice to his doom. The cub's cry tugged her focus, and in that heartbeat, something flickered in her gaze. Recognition, perhaps, of the trap that had nearly claimed her too in her frantic orbits. 10 feet. Her breath steamed, scars stark against her fur, her choice crystallizing. Elias braced, accepting the wager he'd made. Rising to her full height, she loomed, shadow swallowing him, growl vibrating through his ribs. A sovereign force poised to judge. Time froze, their worlds colliding, the mud, the cub, the abyss between man and beast. In her eyes blazed rage and instinct, but beneath, Elias glimpsed a spark that shattered his certainties. As she eased back to all fours, her next act defied every truth he held. Stepping closer, her heat washed over him, and what followed would birth a tale few could believe. A moment rewriting the wild's laws. Instead of lunging, she dipped her head, a soft, desperate sound escaping. Not a snarl, but a plea, raw and unguarded. Her stance softened, eyes darting between Elias and her cub, fury dissolving into something akin to anguish. Elias froze, mind scrambling to reconcile this. Mother bears never bared their throats, never yielded before a human. Then, she did the unimaginable, nudging fallen branches toward him with her nose, her movements slow, almost tender. She was offering aid. Stunned, Elias watched her gather more, piling them into a crude bridge to her cub. Clarity crashed over him like dawn's first light. She wasn't just permitting him. She was joining him. With trembling hands, he laid the branches, forging a stable path through the mire. The mother bear circled to the pool's edge. Then, in a staggering leap of trust, began digging opposite her cub. Her massive paws carved channels, loosening the mud's iron grip. Together, man and bear waged a rescue that defied reason. Elias inched closer, the branches bearing his weight, her efforts weaving with his in a silent pact. The cub stilled, sensing her nearness, fear ebbing into weary hope. The sun climbed, gilding their strange alliance. Elias looped the rope around the cub as her digging freed its prison's hold. Their breaths mingled, predator and human, in a dance beyond nature's script. As the cub began to slip free, she stunned him again, waiting, not charging, as Elias guided the rope to keep it from Resin King. Her patience was a human echo, her trust a quiet miracle. The forest held its breath, awed by this impossibility. With a final pull, the cub broke loose, staggering along the branch path to solid earth. To her, weak but alive, it faltered, mud dripping from its frame. Rather than fleeing, she lingered, watching Elias retreat from the mire. Then, nudging her sodden cub to a stream, she cleaned it with slow, deliberate care, her glances back at him a thread across the wild's divide. The extraordinary unfurled further. After her cub drank, she approached Elias, keeping a respectful span, and lowered her head in what could only be gratitude, her eyes a well of depth that remade his understanding. Then, she gathered berries in her mouth, placing them on a flat stone near him. An offering so alien to bear ways, Elias blinked to anchor it in reality. The cub, reviving, watched with wide, curious eyes, mirroring her calm. It edged toward him before she gently guided it back with a grunt. Their exchange a whisper of something human-like. Time paused, sunlight bathing them, her wet fur gleaming, her form softened, rumbling sounds carrying meaning beyond his grasp. For nearly an hour they lingered, she tending her cub, casting gentle looks at Elias, teaching it humans weren't always foes. The cub, following her cue, grew bold, not fearful, sniffing the air with tentative wonder. As the sun crested, she nudged her cub to depart, but first rose on hind legs, pressing a paw into the earth. A deliberate mark, a seal on their encounter. This defied every instinct, every law of the wild. 3 days later, as Elias sat on his porch, pen scratching reports, she emerged from the trees, berries in mouth, placing them near his steps before retreating. This became a ritual, weekly visits with berries or fish plucked from the stream. Her cub growing sturdy yet cautious, its muddied past yielding to a playful gleam. Word spread among wardens. Skepticism melted into wonder as they witnessed her quiet offerings. Veterans with decades in the wild had no parallel. Elias photographed these moments, her sitting serene as he worked, the cub tumbling with pine cones yards away, images of trust that defied textbooks. Scholars took notice, erecting observation posts near his cabin, tracing her patterns. Her actions hinted at memory, emotion beyond reflex. She recalled his aid and wove their bond with intent. As spring warmed to summer, she'd grunt softly, waiting for his nod, never nearing if others lingered, her discernment uncanny. Her cub ventured closer, trust a gift from her. Locals shifted from dread to reverence, school groups flocking to hear Elias recount the rescue and its aftermath, a saga fueling lessons on the wild's worth. Forest ways evolved, the mud site was charted, hazards flagged, his ordeal birthing new protocols. Through summer, Elias logged each visit. She came at dawn or dusk, purposeful as if cherishing their tie. The cubs first shone, a white chest patch its banner. Wardens called it fortune, though Elias left them nameless, honoring their wild souls. As autumn whispered in, visits thinned, they fattened for winter's sleep. On a crisp October morn, they lingered at the forest's edge, a long farewell before hibernation's embrace. This chapter rewrote Elias's world, not just of bears, but of the fragile line between instinct and gratitude's quiet song. Her actions sparked study, wonder, debate. For more tales of the wild's marvels, subscribe and follow. Don't miss these stories of bonds that defy. Hit the bell and let's wander nature's wonders together.